Well, years ago, I read Johnny Cash's autobiography that he wrote in the early 1990s. And in it, he's sort of content to fade into the background. He was admitting that his career was essentially over. His heyday had been decades before. He hadn't had a hit in years. His record label had dropped him. And so at the end, he just kind of had resolved to fade away, having no idea that soon after he wrote it, he'd be approached by one of the co-founders of Def Jam Records and invited to do a series of recordings. And he said, how is that gonna work? How is the guy who just produced Run DMC gonna take a washed up country star and do something with him? But he said, I just want you to come with a guitar and sing the songs that are on your heart as you enter the last days of your life. And what resulted from that partnership are some of the most iconic songs in American history. And it's fascinating because they ended up making 6 records at the end, he and Rick Rubin, but the songs that got up in the most media attention, became some of the most popular of Johnny Cash's life, were all about God, his arrival at the end of days, and impending judgment. When the man comes around is a song about the return of Jesus Christ, and you hear Johnny Cash in that rusty baritone voice quoting Revelation about a pale horse coming. And it's intimidating, it's terrifying. I think part of what was arresting was seeing this old musician return dressed in all black with that kind of gravelly voice talking about judgment is coming. One of his last songs was the old folk song, God is gonna cut you down. You can run on for a long time. Run on for a long time. Run on for a long time. But sooner or later, God will cut you down. Sooner or later, God will cut you down. And they made a video about it. And the video starred everyone from Whoopi Goldberg to Woody Harrelson, Justin Timberlake to Jay-Z, Kid Rock and Chris Rock. And you're watching it and going, what is happening? And the best I can tell is there is a fascination with us in the judgment of God. It was wild to watch these songs hit, even as the church was approaching the seeker-sensitive movement of don't talk about the judgment of God, and yet we were fascinated by songs about it. My children, I play them random songs in the car, and I don't tell them the genre or the decade. I just want to hear how they respond and what they're attracted to. And it's been interesting to watch them over the years. They love Marty Robbins, the old cowboy singer. I'm like, why? And they love the songs that are stories about outlaws for whom judgment is coming and there is no escape. Middle school kids, if you ask them, what do you want to study? What do they always say? The book of Revelation. We want to know about the end times and how it will be. We love apocalyptic movies. John Wick, the first one, was a surprise hit. People thought Keanu Reeves' career was over. And they asked him, why is there success in this movie? And he said, I think it's because we're drawn to the Old Testament picture of judgment coming upon the unrighteous. That we long for judgment. Some of us were fascinated by it, even as we're terrified by it. Why am I bringing this up? Because we've been studying the book of Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 2, we got an image. The believer in God and the Babylonian got to see what God does with the nations, that God raises up nations for his purposes and deposes them. Kingdoms rise and fall, but one day God's kingdom will come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And yet we saw as the nations rage against God's people, God will preserve a remnant in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, he will humble the proud. And yet God is gracious and offers redemption even to the most wicked among us. Even Nebuchadnezzar is not too far for the grace of God to reach. But at some point, if we persist in our rebellion against the grace of God, judgment falls. And that's where we are in Daniel chapter 5. We are about to watch the fall of Babylon the Great. Buckle up. All right, so to begin, verse 1. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Now, if you've been following along, you might ask the question, who is King Belshazzar? I'm 4 chapters in, and it's always been King Nebuchadnezzar. He's been the king the whole time. Who's this guy? Well, we have fast forwarded again in the story. King Nebuchadnezzar reigned over Babylon for over 40 years, and he brought it to the height of its glory and its power. And after he was done, the entire kingdom of Babylon, one of the greatest nations, empires in human history, has 25 years left and it will fall. It enters its death spiral. that after Nebuchadnezzar, he was succeeded by his son, whom he named Evil. He reigned for 2 years and was assassinated by his brother-in-law. He reigned for 4 years and then was done, handed the kingdom off to his son, who was killed after 2 months. And finally, the kingdom came to a guy named Nabonidus, who history knows as the final king of Babylon. And yet you hear he's the final king of Babylon, then who's King Belshazzar? It's interesting, the name Belshazzar, we never saw outside the book of Daniel till the last half of the 19th century. So for generations, commentators and historians would say, there was no King Belshazzar, so this is a made-up story, it's make-believe, your whole Bible's make-believe, all this is fake, until archaeologists discovered 37 archival texts about King Belshazzar. Whoops. Turns out, he was co-regent with his dad. And Nabonidus, his dad, was a worshiper of the moon god, which wasn't popular in Babylon. So he went 500 miles away to live in an oasis out in the desert and spend over a decade off alone and handed off co-regency to his son, Belshazzar, who ruled in the great town of Babylon. And King Belshazzar, the Greek historian Xenophon, says about this guy, he was riotous, indulgent, cruel, and a godless young man. Later in the text, it just calls him the wicked king. There's one story, we don't have time to go into his whole background, but there's one famous story where he killed the only son of one of his governors because he got jealous of him while they were hunting. This is a spoiled brat of a kid. That's who King Belshazzar is. He's Joaquin Phoenix's character in Gladiator. Did nothing to build Rome, but is now a petulant child as he leads it. He's the mobster's son in the original John Wick, right? An arrogant, foolish kid who stole John Wick's car and murdered his dog and has no idea that judgment is coming. That's King Belshazzar, right? And our story opens with him hosting a huge banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. That is not without precedent in the ancient world. Alexander the Great hosted a banquet for 10,000 nobles at once. It was a display of my glory and benevolence, right? And yet that opening sentence is also pregnant with meaning. Verse 1, if you don't know this, you'll miss it. It's like if I said, Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater. Ooh. JFK took a ride in a convertible in Dallas. Ooh. More is going on in those words than what you know, right? There's a feeling of impending doom. And what history tells us all throughout the record is that on the last day of the great empire of Babylon, they were feasting and partying, drinking and making merry all night long. What we just tuned into is the last day of one of the greatest kingdoms in the history of humanity. And we actually know what day this was, October 12th, 539 BC, exactly 2,563 years ago this week. That has no relevance. I just thought that was fascinating. I didn't time that at all. Now, what was the purpose of this banquet? What's crazy is we know from history, the Medo-Persian Empire has surrounded the walls of the city of Babylon. That here his dad, Nabonidus, has already fled. The enemy is at the gates. So why throw a party? Well, simply out of arrogance. Because Babylon was famous for its massive walls, 25 feet thick, 40 feet high. They had channeled the river Euphrates to run under the walls so you couldn't besiege us and starve us out. We had the river here in our city. We had stocked up food for years. I am invincible, untouchable, and I ain't scared. That's what he's trying to say. So I'll throw a party. And then notice it says, and he drank in front of his guests. You go, okay, what does that mean? Well, in the ancient world, kings would often sit in a special VIP section away from the crowd as a symbol of decorum. Here, this king deliberately sits out in front of everyone, and that word drinking carries the idea of continuous activity. The book of Proverbs says that it is not for a king to drink much wine, that those who lead need to keep their head. But what you have here with the petulant young king is he has now abandoned himself to sensuality, and he's done it in public. Right? And then this party takes a blasphemous turn. Verse 2, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the kings and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. from self-indulgent to sacrilege. The tasting there, by the way, it doesn't mean that he was just getting a sense of the flavors, right? It means that dude was tasting some wine. And as he does, he starts feeling strong and he puts himself up against God alone. Even pagan superstition would keep you from daring the gods and mocking them. This is letting you know that this guy has abandoned decency, which incidentally, ladies, when it mentions there that his wives and concubines were at dinner, that's not a statement of egalitarianism, like, oh, look at him, the women came and were part of his court too. No, we don't have time to read all this, but that kingdom at that time, they would bring the women and they said, as we drank, we would make our concubines sit by us. And I won't quote you the rest of the text, but it was so we could get handsy with them. So this party is gross. It's a freak off. It's a freak off, okay? That's what this is. And in the midst of this, as is often the case, when a nation gets strong, it gets arrogant. And when it gets arrogant, it gets into sensuality. And sensuality becomes sacrilege. For some reason, we don't just want to get enamored with sensuality, we begin to mock God in the process. And here he chooses to do that, and he blasphemes Israel's God. He takes the articles from the temple of God in Jerusalem and begins to drink out of them at his party. Now, why does he do that, and why is that so bad? Well, it might be because Daniel and the prophet Isaiah had both prophesied Babylon will fall and the Medo-Persians will do it. And so it could be that as they surround him, he says, I'm not scared of them and I defy your God. It could be because of that. Or it could be that one chapter before, the greatest king in Babylon's history, Nebuchadnezzar, had been humbled by Yahweh, Israel's God, and had humbled himself before him and became a worshiper of the one true God. And here the idea is, hey, what humbled my daddy doesn't humble me. That the insecure king says, hey, I rule and I'm not scared. I am tougher than my daddy. That's the idea. And while he's feeling himself and feeling strong, in verse 5, suddenly something sobers him up. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the palace, a king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. One commentator called this the most haunting image in literature. A detached hand begins to appear and write on the wall. Now, let me just stop here briefly. I don't have time to get into all this, but some people go, see, that's the Bible. Crazy things are always happening. That's why it feels like make-believe. Crazy stuff doesn't happen nowadays. Well, let me explain. The Bible will skip decades, kingdoms, centuries. It's the high points of God's interaction with humanity. That's why one story after another is interesting. We'll skip 5 kings. We don't care what evil Merodach did. But when a hand writes on a wall, we're going to write it down. So the Bible's telling you about this moment because it is weird, because it's not normal. That a big, detached human hand starts to sketch words out into the plaster, and it says it's by the lampstand, so you see, it was in broad light. It wasn't like he saw something out of the corner. It was like, was that a squirrel? Was that a hand? What was it? No, he saw a hand in the light writing, and it sobers this man up. In verse 6, it says, the king's color changed. He became white as a ghost. His thoughts alarmed him. He was terrified. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Now, there's some debate on the translation of his limbs gave way. The literal language in the text was, the knots of his loins were unloosened. Commentators divide. Some believe that the knots of his loins are his hip joints, that as he got scared, his legs went limp, and that's why his knees knocked together. That's a valid way to understand that. Others believe the knots of his loins are his bowels, that he lost bowel control. In other words, he should have worn his brown pants. So the point is, this party just went sideways for King Belshazzar. And he begins to cry. In verse 7, the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. He appeals to his wealth to solve his problems. I'll give money to anyone who fixes this for me. Clothed in purple, that's the color of royalty. Purple was hard to make. With a pendant around your neck, that was a symbol of glory. And I'll give you third in rank. His dad was 1, he was 2. I'll make you the highest I can make you. I will give you power and I will give you glory if you solve this problem for me. But in verse 8, then all the king's wise men came in, and they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His color changed, and his lords were perplexed. They don't know what it means. And so the scene goes from party to panic. And in verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the kings and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change." Now, who's the queen? We just found out earlier that his wives were there. Commentators all the way back to Josephus in the first century all agree this is not his wife. This is the queen mother. Mama hears her boy screaming down the hall, and she walks in and begins to tell him to get a hold of himself. And in the midst of this crazy frat party, mom begins to lecture them on the answer. Verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. She said, the great king knew how to handle this. Your father, maybe because he was biologically related to him, we don't have time to go into that, or probably just because he was in the lineage of this great king. He says, the ancients understood what made our kingdom great was the word of God. What led to our blessing was the revelation he could give us about how the world works and how to work within it. But a generation has arisen that does not know God and doesn't know his word, and you've descended into chaos. And so you need to go back. Like Joseph in Egypt, a Pharaoh rose up who did not know Joseph or the good he had done as he led to the blessing of Egypt. In the book of Judges, a generation grew up who did not know the Lord. Is it possible for a nation to forget the God who made them great? This king is biblically illiterate. And she says, you need Daniel. You need the believer to tell you the words of God. He's got an excellent spirit, extraordinary spirit. It means he wasn't just moral, he spiritually was in tune because he could untie knots and mysteries. He knew what God was up to. And so in verse 13, Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king answered and said to Daniel, you're that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah whom the king my father brought from Judah? Notice how he addresses Daniel. She called him who had an extraordinary spirit and had wisdom and understanding to understand mysteries. He says, aren't you the exile that my dad brought over here? He remains proud and arrogant in his ignorance. That's the toughest combination. Arrogance and ignorance together, it's tough to deal with. Verse 14, I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I've heard that you can give interpretation and solve problems. Now, if you can, read the writing on the wall and make it known to me its interpretation, and you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be third in the ruler of the kingdom. I have heard twice, so if you can, get this done and I'll pay you, right? Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. God is not for sale, and neither am I. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him its interpretation. He says, hey, you can't buy God and you can't buy your way out of this. Also, it's worth noting, Daniel's probably about 80 at this time. So this isn't teenage Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar. This is I'm old and don't care anymore era Daniel, okay? So you gotta get the vibe. He walks in and was like, you know what? I'm gonna do this one for free, buckle up. And before he gives the interpretation, Daniel will lecture the king. Now I want you to notice something. In the Bible, in these ancient texts, they didn't have punctuation or capitalization. So how do you emphasize? Real estate, how much space does it take? This paragraph is the longest in the chapter because this paragraph is the point. So don't miss this. Verse 18. O king, The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship, and greatness, and glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave to him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed. Whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up. And whom he would, he humbled. God made your dad great and gave him the power to raise up and gave him the power to put down. So he acknowledges the greatness of the king, but acknowledges it's a derivative glory. You are what you are and have what you have because God gave it to you, right? Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne and his glory was taken from him. The king who could raise up and put down, when he became proud, the God who raised him up put him down and humbled him. Verse 21, he was driven from among the children of mankind. His mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was made with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. That's a summary of the last chapter. The idea being is that arrogance makes you crazy. And absolute power corrupts. It can make you think that you rule reality and you don't. And he says, so your dad went nuts. And the reality is when we believe we are gods, this is the lie from Genesis chapter 3. You can be like God. You be the arbiter of good and evil. You don't need to bow and submit. You rule your life. It's interesting. I just watched an interview my wife sent me with, and I always say his name wrong. Shia LaBeouf? Someone help me later. He was talking in this interview about how he never had a need for God. He said, I understood that my life is my life. And I get a job, I earn some money, I meet a girl, I have a wife, make her my wife, we have kids. He said, and I will ascend to success by my managerial skill. So when someone said, you need God, my first thought was, no, I don't. My skill will get me to the kingdom, the power, and the glory. He said, until in my arrogance, I started to destroy my life, hurt the people I love, and do things I'm deeply ashamed of. He said, and I got myself into a spiral I couldn't get out of. And that's when I realized I can't ascend to the heights of God. I need to cry out to him for help. God didn't just humble me, he acclimated me to reality. And that's what God does, right? God helps us see, yes, I've blessed you, but you are who you are because of what God has done. I read the biography of Andrew Jackson on accident. Won't go into the story, but he was not a nice guy as a president. But when he retired, he used to never go to church. He went to church at the end of his life. And while he was there, the Reverend recognized him. And the Reverend began to weave Andrew Jackson's story into the sermon without ever using his name. I won't tell you whether or not I've ever done that to you, but the Reverend Edgar began to say, the career of a man who, in addition to the ordinary dangers of human life, has encountered those of wilderness, of war, of political conflict, who's escaped the tomahawk and the attack of his country's enemies, the privations and fatigues of border warfare, and the aim of an assassin. How is it that a man endowed with reason and gifted with intelligence can pass through such scenes unharmed and not see the hand of God in his deliverance? You really think you did this? Or did God make you what you are? And Andrew Jackson did not like that sermon. It bothered him. And so he called the pastor to come to his house, and the pastor said, I'm busy visiting other people, and that bothered him. How dare you put me off? But as he had to sit alone with his thoughts out in the wilderness, it struck him. I am who I am because God made me. Man proposes, but God disposes. That's how Ulysses S. Grant began his memoir. We make our plans, but God determines our steps. And he humbled himself, and at the end of his life, repented. And here he says, your dad understood his greatness is derivative, which incidentally is not God being petty. An undisciplined child is a menace to society and to themselves. A child that's never reined in and demands that they be served as a God is insufferable. So we discipline our children, not for our ego, but for their sanity. Do you think God shouldn't do that to you? And God says, you need to humble yourself under me, not because I'm insecure and need worship, but because you need to worship me. It's good for you. Because if you don't acknowledge the God who obviously made all this because you didn't, you will go crazy. And here he says, your dad went crazy. But when he acknowledged heaven, his sanity returned and his glory came back and he was able to lead. God gave everything back. He just had to give him the right kind of heart. So he'd lead out of worship and love from a healthy place. But then Daniel turns the corner in verse 22. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Nebuchadnezzar was ignorant of God, and God sent him dreams and Daniel to interpret them. Some people get divine intervention through dreams. Belshazzar, you got to watch your dad. You got to watch him be great. You got to watch him be humbled. You got to watch him worship. You got a testimony. And you not only blew that God off, you defied him. Verse 23, you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house you brought in before you, and your lords and your wives, your concubines have drunk from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze and iron, wood and stone, the gods you get to control, because you don't want to submit to a God who controls you. But those gods don't see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and in whom are all your ways, you have not honored. You knew, you ignored, you exalted, you desecrated, you disregarded. You are culpable. You knew enough to seek God and you didn't. We have many things posted on our fridge at the Stuart house. Calendars, reminders, our compassion kids that we support. And we have a little piece of paper that's topped with the words dishonesty, disrespect, disobedience. Those are the three things that bring judgment, right? My kids do many destructive things out of ignorance, like put foil in the microwave. That does not initiate discipline. That initiates instruction. No, baby, don't do that because you'll destroy the microwave and burn down everything we possess, right? And so it initiates teaching. You didn't know, but never do it again, okay? But when you know better, when mom says, put away your dishes, and you say, no, I decide, and you go play a video game, that's when you get in trouble. Because you didn't just break a law, you disrespected your mother. You don't get to do that in this house. And I love you too much to make you an insufferable child, right? And here he says, you knew all this. You knew better. You knew it. You knew it and you defied him. And he said, no, I'm gonna chase gold. I'm gonna chase wood. I'm gonna chase stone. I'm gonna chase that which exalts me. Rather than asking the question of who made all this and why. Who put me here and what am I for? You didn't do that. And so now, verse 24, the writing is on the wall. Then from his presence the hand was sent and the writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now let me explain the interpretation there. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. As nouns, they are weights and denominations of money, like the word pound for the English, right? And so the English pound you use to buy, for them, a mene, a tekel, a parsin, these were denominations of money and weights you would use in the marketplace. If I want to buy some wheat, we measure it out, right? And so it carries the idea of a measure. This is probably why it confused the Chaldeans and astrologers and such. They knew these words, but they're like, why are denominations of money written on the wall? And so what Daniel does is help them see, like the word pound, it can be a noun and also a verb. And these words have a verbal element. And Daniel says, it's not just the denominations of money, it's the passive participle form of the verb that's gonna help you understand. Mene means numbered. Tekel means weighed, and parson means broken. And so what it says, and it's in writing, the divine decree is certain: numbered, weighed, and shattered. The writing's on the wall. Your days are numbered, which incidentally is where that comes from, right? That language. You have been weighed, meaning you've been evaluated, and you've been found too light. You don't have the weight of moral worth. And so you're divided. Your kingdom is shattered. Numbered, weighed, shattered. Verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command. Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. You think Daniel was impressed by that? Like, hey, I told you this night your kingdom's going away, so you made me third in command of the Titanic? Like, this is not a win. It's actually one of my favorite scenes in the Bible, to think of old Daniel telling him, like, this is all going down, and then they put like a crown on him and a pendant and purple robe, and he's like, someone paint that portrait, right? Verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, let me apply this to us and we'll wrap up. Incidentally, history lets us know what happened this night. The river Euphrates running through the city to provide water so we couldn't be besieged, the Medo-Persians just redirected it. And then they came underneath the walls through the water systems to find them at a party and kill them. And there was a man named Gobryas who led them in, who had defected from the Babylonians. He was the governor whose only son was murdered by a petulant kid. And so he led them into the kingdom, found the king attempting to kill himself, took the knife from him, and did it for him. And so he is judged. You see it? Now, what does this have to do with us? There's applications for nations, but there's applications for individuals, right? And so let's focus on that. A couple ideas. God rules over the fates of men. He gives common grace to all. And so he will allow great blessing and success even to people who blow him off. God will let Nebuchadnezzar's thrive. Why does God let the wicked prosper? Who is without sin? What perfect person does he have to work with? So he lets the sun shine on the righteous and the unrighteous. And God will raise up kings and raise up kingdoms by his power. And yet human beings make real choices, and we're held accountable for those choices. God rules, and God is patient, and he will allow sin to continue, often further than we like. It's funny, I'll have people tell me, man, the God in the Old Testament is so mean, he's just constantly judging people. And what I realize when they say that is, what they're really saying is, I've never read my Bible. Because when you read the Old Testament and read the dates, God will let evil persist for hundreds of years. And so read the dates as you read through it. God will let injustice reign so much that prophets like Habakkuk will say, how long, God? When you really read the Bible, you don't say God is rash to judgment. You start to question why he's so slow as you see injustice increase around the world. Why so much human trafficking? Why so much abuse of the weak and the poor? Why let it persist, God? Because he is patient, not wanting to judge any, but that all might come to repentance. But his patience, don't mistake it for impotence. He is strong, but he is loving, and he is slow to anger, but he is not idle in his threats. He will announce judgment, but he announces it because judgment is the last thing he wants to do. He announces judgment is coming on the path you're on, not just so he can tell you so that when he does it, you know it was him, though that's why we have these passages. So we know when he told them they were judged, and they were, when he tells you you're judged, he's not joking. But he tells you that, why? So that like Nebuchadnezzar did in the last chapter, you might break off from sin, repent, and live. God does not delight in the judgment of wicked at all, but rather that they might turn and live. And so Moses prayed in Psalm 90, God, teach us to number our days aright so we might present you a heart of wisdom. Here's the reality for us. We're made in the image of God. It is not just Nebuchadnezzar who has God-like qualities. The Bible says we're made in God's image. All of us have been given a certain degree of dignity and power and glory and honor. But all of us have been weighed and found wanting. That's what the New Testament says. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And all of us one day will get tapped on the shoulder and told to leave the party of this life. Our days are numbered and we are found wanting. And yet, we don't have to be divided. We don't have to be shattered. Why? Because the same New Testament that says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, says, but God, who is rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we are sinners, Christ died for us. And by his grace, we are saved. Not as a result of works, so that no one can boast. By his grace, we're saved through faith. That's how it works. That I acknowledge heaven rules. God made this, he made me. I'm not just gonna chase after wood, stone, gold, and silver. There's a God who I'm made by and I'm made for. Let me go on a journey of figuring out, why am I here? And let me, like a child, learn from my Father. And then when I see where I've fallen short, rather than the suicidal obsession with building my kingdom for my power, my glory, which will fade, I begin to learn about what it is to be a person who lives for his kingdom and his power and his glory that won't. And our blessing comes the same way Nebuchadnezzar did. The great king had to humble himself to learn from this lowly Jewish prophet. And for us, in all of our power, we are meant to come and sit at the feet of the lowly King Jesus. He deserved all glory, might, and honor, but he came and lived a life of homelessness for us. He said, I don't have a home. I forego riches. I'm not asking you to do something I didn't do for you. I humbled myself, even to death on a cross, so you don't have to break because I broke. I put myself in the scale for you. And when you put your faith in Jesus, you do not have to face judgment. You get mercy. You get to be Nebuchadnezzar, not Belshazzar. You see it? So Johnny Cash, in the end, wrote, when the man comes around, he's coming. And he wrote, God's gonna cut you down, which is a terrifying song with a very good beat. But then he did a cover of a Nine Inch Nails song. Nine Inch Nails had written this song, Hurt, when Trent Reznor was in his 20s. It was him lamenting that his drug addiction had caused him to ruin his life. And so it's a 20-year-old young man just lamenting. And if you watch the video of him singing the song Hurt, behind him on a video is a flower slowly dying as he sings this song, right? About how you can have it all. My empire of dirt. I will let you down. I'll make you hurt. I had power over my life, and what I built is an empire of dirt. And as a 20-something, it's a depressing song, but you also look and go, you got your whole life in front of you, bud. You know, let's get you sobered up. There's a lot you can figure it out. But when Johnny Cash covered it in his 70s, it's real different. And his video was not a wilting flower, it was him sitting in the now closed House of Cash, the museum about him that had been abandoned years before. And there, among the wreckage of his accomplishments, he set a banqueting table. And at the table, this old man sings the same words. You can have it all, my empire of dirt. He says, I built something glorious, but in the end, what does it all matter? Everyone I love goes away in the end. Kingdoms rise and fall, and all the kingdoms of men and women fade. But then the most fascinating thing happens. In the midst of this sad song, he sings the same words at the end. If I could start again, 1,000,000 miles away, I would keep myself and find a way. When Trent sang it, it was with an air of hopelessness, and the flower dies. As Johnny sings it, he pours out a glass of wine on the table as an imagery from the Old Testament sacrifices. The pouring out of the wine offering means I'm done. It's the last thing at the end of the days. He would die a few months later. But interspersed with that image, they show, if I could start again, 1,000,000 miles away, I'd find a way. And as the hammering on the piano continues unrelentlessly, it starts to match the hammering of the nails into the arms of Jesus Christ. And here the wreckage of the kingdom of Johnny Cash is melded with the breaking and the shattering of the Son of God. But when he says, if I could start again, I'd find a way. You see, out of the breaking of Christ on the cross, a dove appear and fly into the heavens. There's hope. There is life. It does not need to spiral into hopelessness. Johnny Cash died with hope in the end. He was asked, how do you feel about coming towards death? And he says, I can't wait to see the face of my King who died for me. So I don't know what kingdom you're here to build. I don't know where you think hope is found. We should do good things. And yes, I want America to flourish. This isn't a political talk. Some of you are like, what does this mean for the election? Here's what it means. America doesn't have a soul. America's filled with people with souls. So I'm not gonna give a sermon about how America needs to repent. How can America repent? But you can. And if enough of us do, if enough of human beings in our country say it's the word of God that makes women and men great, and yet we have built our own kingdoms for our own power and our own glory, and we've become petulant kings. And judgment is coming, and rightly so, for all have sinned and fallen short. And yet when God announces judgment, it's because the last thing he wants to do, you're not too far gone. And if he'll save Nebuchadnezzar's and Johnny Cash's, he will save you. But what does it require? Not trying to earn your way to heaven, but by bowing the knee and saying, you came and broke for me. The King came for me, and I'm living for you. And like Nebuchadnezzar, he says, you know what? I will give you glory back. I give you purpose back. I will give you meaning back. I want to give you a life of great meaning and purpose because you were made by me and for me. And when you come to me, I don't crush you. I make you who you were meant to be. That's the hope of Daniel. These are the days of grace. Judgment is coming, but this need not be our story.